What if the person sworn to defend the law was quietly bending it for years? What if a single family name carried so much power that it could silence questions, shape outcomes, and delay justice? Until one night, everything finally collapsed. On June 7th, 2021, in the still darkness of rural South Carolina, a man with generations of legal authority behind him picked up his phone and made a call that would echo across the nation. His voice was calm, almost controlled. "My wife and my son have been shot." In that moment, the image was clear: a devastated husband, a grieving father, a respected attorney facing unimaginable loss. But behind that call, behind the badge of respectability, behind the long shadow of a powerful family name, a very different story was already unfolding. This was not just the story of a murder. It was the story of power without accountability, of trust abused, of secrets hidden in plain sight for decades. This is the story of Alex Murdaugh. To understand this case, you must first understand the place where it happened. South Carolina's Lowcountry is quiet, rural, and deeply traditional. Long stretches of farmland. Small towns where families know each other for generations. Where reputations matter and last. In these communities, certain names carry weight. And for nearly a century, no name carried more weight than Murdaugh. The Murdaugh family wasn't just part of the legal system. They were the legal system. For almost 90 years, members of the Murdaugh family served as solicitors, prosecutors in the region. They controlled courtrooms, influenced politics, and built relationships that reached into law enforcement, banking, and business. If your case involved a Murdaugh, you didn't expect to win. If you needed legal help, you trusted them without question. And at the center of this dynasty stood Alex Murdaugh, a man raised not just to practice law, but to inherit power. Alex Murdaugh was a third-generation attorney, educated, well-connected, known for his friendly demeanor and polished Southern charm. He worked at the family law firm, handling personal injury cases and representing clients who trusted him with their futures and their finances. To the public, Alex appeared successful, stable, respected, a family man. But appearances, as this case would reveal, can be carefully constructed. Behind closed doors, investigators would later uncover a man under enormous pressure, financial, professional, and personal, long before the murders ever happened. At the heart of this tragedy are the victims. Maggie Murdaugh, Alex's wife, was known as private and reserved. She split her time between the family's properties, including their rural estate known as Moselle, a vast hunting property surrounded by trees, fields, and isolation. Maggie lived a life that appeared comfortable, even privileged. But friends would later say she was increasingly distant from Alex in the years leading up to the murders. Then there was Paul Murdaugh, the younger of the couple's two sons. Paul was a complicated figure, charismatic, reckless, known in local circles for his heavy drinking and impulsive behavior. In 2019, Paul became nationally known after a fatal boating accident that killed 19-year-old Mallory Beach. Paul was later charged, and the case placed intense legal and public pressure on the Murdaugh family. For the first time, the Murdaugh name was being questioned, not respected. Lawsuits followed. Scrutiny increased. And the walls that once protected the family began to crack. By 2021, the Murdaugh family was facing a storm. The boating case had not gone away. Civil lawsuits were closing in. Financial records were being questioned. Behind the scenes, Alex Murdaugh was living a double life, one that investigators would later describe as a web of lies, theft, and deception stretching back years. Money was disappearing, clients were being defrauded, and exposure was inevitable. But on the surface, life continued as normal, until the night everything stopped. On June 7th, 2021, Maggie and Paul were at the Moselle property. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, but sometime after nightfall, something went terribly wrong. Alex Murdaugh would later claim he was not present, that he had gone to visit his elderly mother and returned to discover the unthinkable. 2 members of his family were dead. Law enforcement arrived at the scene and quickly realized this was no ordinary crime. The victims weren't strangers. They weren't victims of random violence. They were members of one of the most powerful families in the state. And the man who called 9/11 was also the man with the most to lose. In the days following the murders, the community rallied around Alex Murdaugh. He was seen as a broken man, a father who had lost his son, a husband who had lost his wife. But quietly, investigators began to notice inconsistencies. Timelines didn't align. Statements changed. Digital evidence raised new questions. And as law enforcement dug deeper, they uncovered something even more disturbing than the murders themselves: a financial collapse hidden beneath years of trust. The murders were no longer the beginning of the story. They were the moment everything finally came to light. What started as a tragic double homicide soon exposed one of the largest criminal scandals in South Carolina history. The trusted lawyer, the respected family man, the legal heir to a powerful dynasty, was now standing at the center of a case that would challenge everything the community believed about justice, privilege, and accountability. How did it come to this? Was this a crime of passion, a desperate act, or the final move of a man whose carefully built world was collapsing? Those answers would take years to uncover. But one truth was already clear: the Murdaugh name would never mean the same thing again. And this was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we trace the timeline, from long-buried secrets to the night that exposed them all. Because sometimes, the most shocking crimes don't come from outsiders. They come from the inside. What if the murders were not the beginning of the story, but the final chapter of a disaster that had been building for years? What if every warning sign had already appeared, ignored, dismissed, or protected by power, until one night made it impossible to look away? To understand what happened at Moselle, you must go back. Not days, not months, but years. February 2019. The boating accident, the first crack in the Murdaugh dynasty, appeared on a cold February night in 2019. Paul Murdaugh, then 19 years old, was involved in a late-night boating accident in Beaufort County, South Carolina. The boat slammed into a bridge piling. Mallory Beach, a 19-year-old college student, was thrown into the water and never resurfaced alive. The accident shocked the community, but what followed raised even more questions. Witnesses alleged Paul was heavily intoxicated. Yet at the scene, confusion surrounded who was responsible. Paul was not immediately arrested. His family name loomed large. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew among the Beach family and the public. Many believed Paul was being shielded from consequences. Eventually, Paul was charged with felony boating under the influence, but the damage was already done. The Murdaugh name was no longer untouchable. 2019 to 2020, pressure builds, civil lawsuits followed. The Beach family sued Alex Murdaugh, alleging he allowed his underage son access to alcohol. Depositions loomed. Financial records were demanded. And for the first time, Alex Murdaugh's finances were being examined under oath. Behind the scenes, investigators would later learn that Alex was already in serious trouble. Money was missing. Clients were being lied to. Settlements were being diverted. But none of that was public yet. Outwardly, the Murdaugh family maintained its image. Inwardly, the walls were closing in. Early 2021. A family on edge. By early 2021, multiple forces were converging. Paul's criminal case was still pending. Civil trials threatened to expose financial details. And Alex Murdaugh's law firm was beginning to question irregularities in his accounts. Friends later described tension within the family. Maggie was reportedly spending more time away from Alex. The family was no longer united the way it once was. What had once been a shield of privilege was becoming a spotlight, and Alex Murdaugh was running out of options. June 7th, 2021. The day everything changed. June 7th, 2021, began like any other day. There were no public signs that this night would change everything. That evening, Maggie and Paul were both at the family's rural estate, Moselle, a sprawling hunting property surrounded by woods and isolation. At some point after nightfall, Maggie and Paul went to the dog kennels on the property. What happened next would become one of the most scrutinized timelines in modern true crime. Sometime later, Alex Murdaugh dialed 911. He told the dispatcher he had returned home and found his wife and son shot. Law enforcement rushed to the scene. 2 members of one of South Carolina's most powerful families were dead. The immediate aftermath, the reaction was swift and emotional. News spread rapidly through the Lowcountry. Shock, sympathy, disbelief. At first, Alex Murdaugh was not treated as a suspect. He was viewed as a victim, a man devastated by unimaginable loss. Authorities stated there was no immediate danger to the public. But behind the scenes, investigators were already preserving evidence and reconstructing timelines. because from the beginning, this crime felt personal. Early questions emerge as investigators began piecing together the hours leading up to the murders. Questions emerged. Why were Maggie and Paul both at Moselle that night? Why had Maggie reportedly been reluctant to go there earlier? And why did Alex's timeline raise inconsistencies? Cell phone records, vehicle data, digital timestamps. Each detail mattered, and slowly, the narrative began to shift. Days after the murders, a widening investigation in the days following the killings, investigators broadened their focus. This was no longer just a double homicide. It was becoming something bigger. Financial crimes investigators uncovered missing settlement money tied to Alex Murdaugh's clients. Law enforcement began examining whether the murders were connected to legal pressure and financial exposure. Public sympathy began to fade. The question was no longer who would want to hurt the Murdaughs. It became, what did Alex Murdaugh have to lose? September 2021, the story fractures 3 months after the murders. The case took a shocking turn. Alex Murdaugh reported being shot on the side of the road in what he claimed was a random attack. Days later, he admitted it was staged. The motive, to secure life insurance money for his surviving son. At that moment, the public narrative collapsed. The grieving father image was gone. What remained was a man unraveling, and investigators realized the murders might not be an isolated act. They might be part of a long pattern of deception. From tragedy to suspicion, the timeline was no longer just about a single night. It now spanned years. From the boating crash, to mounting lawsuits, to missing money, to a staged shooting. Every event pointed toward one conclusion. The murders occurred at the exact moment Alex Murdaugh's world was about to be exposed. What once appeared random now felt calculated. And the question investigators were asking was chillingly simple. Was June 7th, 2021, the moment Alex Murdaugh chose to reset the narrative at any cost? Closing of Part 2, the timeline revealed more than dates and times. It revealed pressure, desperation, and a man standing at the edge of total collapse. But timelines alone don't solve crimes. To understand what truly happened at Moselle, investigators had to dig deeper into evidence, contradictions, and lies hiding in plain sight. In the next chapter, we follow the investigation, step by step, as law enforcement closes in on a suspect no one wanted to believe was possible. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't emerge suddenly. It creeps forward, one detail at a time.
What if the truth was already recorded before anyone even knew a crime had been committed? What if the very evidence meant to preserve a moment in time would become the key to exposing a lie and unraveling a powerful man's story forever? From the moment law enforcement arrived at Moselle, investigators understood one thing clearly. This was not a case they could afford to rush, and it was not a case they could afford to get wrong. In the early hours following the murders, the scene at Moselle was tense and heavily guarded. Local deputies were soon joined by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, the state's top investigative agency. This was no ordinary homicide. The victims were tied to one of the most influential legal families in South Carolina history. Every move would be scrutinized. Every mistake would be questioned. Investigators began with what they always begin with: facts, evidence, and timelines. The Moselle property was vast, isolated, rural, and surrounded by dense land. The crime scene centered around the dog kennels, a location investigators would return to again and again. They documented physical evidence, entry and exit paths, distances between key locations on the property. Nothing was assumed. At this stage, Alex Murdaugh was not officially named a suspect. He was interviewed as a grieving family member. But even then, investigators were quietly testing his account against reality. Alex Murdaugh told officers that he had not been at the kennels when the murders occurred. He said he had gone to visit his elderly mother and returned later to discover Maggie and Paul. At first glance, the story seemed plausible. But investigators are trained to listen for more than words. They listen for consistency. And over time, small discrepancies began to emerge. Times didn't align cleanly. Details shifted. Certainty faded. Not enough to accuse, but enough to question. Modern investigations leave very little to chance. Phones track movement. Cars record speed. Devices log moments people forget or deny. Investigators obtained cell phone data, text messages, call logs, location information. They examined Maggie's phone. They examined Paul's phone. And they examined Alex's phone. What they found would become one of the most critical turning points in the case. On Paul Murdaugh's phone, investigators discovered a short video recorded at the dog kennels. It was taken just minutes before the estimated time of death. The video itself appeared ordinary, a casual moment. But audio analysts believed something extraordinary was hidden in the background. Voices. Investigators concluded that one of those voices belonged to Alex Murdaugh. This discovery directly contradicted his statement that he had not been there. It was the first solid crack in his version of events. A moment frozen in time, before everything changed. Investigators didn't stop there. They examined vehicle data from Alex's car. Modern vehicles record movement patterns. When doors open, when engines start, how fast a car travels. This data was cross-referenced with phone activity, surveillance footage, statements given by Alex. Again, inconsistencies emerged. The timeline became tighter. Less room for error. Less room for innocence. Beyond digital records, investigators conducted dozens of interviews. Friends, family members, employees, neighbors. They gathered surveillance footage from nearby locations. Every sighting mattered. Every recollection was logged. And while no single witness could place Alex at the moment of the murders, the totality of evidence began forming a pattern. Not proof, yet, but pressure. As homicide investigators focused on the crime, another investigation was unfolding quietly alongside it. A financial one. Alex Murdaugh's law firm had discovered irregularities in client accounts. Large sums of money were missing. What began as internal concern quickly escalated into criminal inquiry. Investigators uncovered stolen settlement funds, forged documents, manipulated accounts. Victims were not corporations or faceless entities. They were real people, many of them vulnerable, who trusted Alex Murdaugh during moments of personal tragedy. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Millions of dollars. Gone. As detectives compared notes, a troubling question surfaced. Were the murders connected to the financial collapse? The timing was impossible to ignore. The murders occurred just as Alex's financial crimes were on the verge of exposure. Sympathy could delay scrutiny. Tragedy could shift attention. Investigators began to consider a theory that would have once seemed unthinkable, that the murders were not random, not revenge, but strategic. Slowly, carefully, the investigation narrowed. Alex Murdaugh was no longer just a grieving husband. He was becoming the central figure in multiple criminal inquiries. Still, law enforcement moved deliberately. This case demanded precision. One wrong step could jeopardize everything. So investigators waited. They gathered. They documented. And piece by piece, the truth took shape. There was no single dramatic confession. No sudden arrest. Instead, the investigation advanced the way real cases often do, quietly, relentlessly. A phone video here, and timeline inconsistency there. A financial record that didn't add up. Individually, they raised questions. Together, they told a story. And that story pointed inward, toward the man everyone once trusted. By the end of the investigation's early phase, one thing was undeniable. The murders at Moselle were no longer isolated acts of violence. They were the visible tip of a much deeper collapse. A collapse fueled by lies, money, and desperation. But suspicion alone is not justice. To move forward, investigators needed motive. They needed to explain not just how the murders happened, but why. In the next chapter, we examine the suspect, his past, his pressure, and the motive prosecutors believe drove everything that followed. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't just shocking, it was devastating. What if the motive wasn't rage? What if it wasn't revenge? What if it was something far colder, desperation? As investigators laid the evidence side by side, the focus narrowed to a conclusion few in the Lowcountry ever expected. The suspect was not an outsider, not a stranger, not an enemy lurking in the dark. The suspect was Alex Murdaugh, husband, father, attorney, and heir to one of South Carolina's most powerful legal dynasties. By the summer of 2021, Alex Murdaugh's life was collapsing on multiple fronts. For years, he had lived behind a carefully constructed image, respected lawyer, family man, community leader. But behind that image, prosecutors would later argue, was a man drowning in debt, addiction, and lies. Millions of dollars were missing from client accounts. Internal scrutiny at his law firm was intensifying. Civil lawsuits threatened to expose financial records he could no longer control. And at the center of that pressure stood Paul Murdaugh. Paul's pending criminal case from the 2019 boating accident was moving closer to trial. Depositions were scheduled. Financial disclosures were unavoidable. For Alex Murdaugh, the legal process he had spent his life mastering was now turning against him. Prosecutors did not argue that Alex Murdaugh killed out of hatred. They argued something more disturbing, that he killed out of calculation. According to the state, Alex believed the exposure of his financial crimes was inevitable. His reputation, his career, and his freedom were all slipping away. The murders, prosecutors claimed, served one primary purpose: distraction. A family tragedy would delay lawsuits. A grieving father would generate sympathy, and scrutiny would shift, if only temporarily, away from financial wrongdoing. In the prosecution's view, Maggie and Paul were not targets of anger. They were obstacles. The question haunted the courtroom: why kill a wife? Why kill a son? Prosecutors suggested that Maggie was becoming increasingly distant from Alex and may have been asking questions about finances. Paul, meanwhile, was the living symbol of the legal pressure Alex faced. As long as Paul's case moved forward, Alex's financial life would remain exposed. By removing both, prosecutors argued, Alex believed he could reset the narrative. A tragic story, instead of a criminal one. Alex Murdaugh's defense team forcefully denied the prosecution's claims. They argued there was no direct physical evidence tying Alex to the murders. No murder weapons were ever recovered. No eyewitnesses placed him at the moment of the killings. And no forensic evidence conclusively proved he pulled the trigger. They portrayed Alex as a deeply flawed man, a liar, a thief, an addict, but not a murderer. The defense urged jurors to separate financial crimes from homicide. Bad character, they said, does not equal guilt. But prosecutors countered with a simple argument: lies matter. They pointed out that Alex Murdaugh had repeatedly lied to his family, his clients, his colleagues, and investigators. He lied about money. He lied about timelines. And he lied about where he was on the night of the murders. The kennel video, prosecutors argued, proved Alex was present just minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. To them, this wasn't coincidence. It was consciousness of guilt. Then came the moment that shattered any remaining public sympathy. On a September afternoon in 2021, Alex Murdaugh reported being shot on the side of the road. At first, it appeared he had survived a random attack, but the story unraveled quickly. Alex admitted the shooting had been staged. He had arranged for someone to shoot him, hoping his death would allow his surviving son to collect insurance money. To investigators and prosecutors, this event was critical. It demonstrated a pattern, a willingness to manipulate tragedy, a willingness to deceive authorities, a willingness to sacrifice truth for control. If Alex could stage his own death, they argued, what else was he capable of? The prosecution emphasized that motive does not require emotion. Sometimes it requires fear. Fear of exposure, fear of disgrace, fear of losing everything. They argued Alex Murdaugh believed the murders were the only way to delay his inevitable downfall. The defense insisted this theory was built on speculation, not proof. But as jurors listened to weeks of testimony, a pattern emerged, not of violence, but of deception. By the time the trial reached this phase, the image of Alex Murdaugh had transformed completely. No longer a grieving patriarch, no longer a trusted attorney. He was now seen as a man who had lived behind lies for years and was willing to do almost anything to maintain control. The question before the jury was no longer whether Alex Murdaugh was capable of wrongdoing. It was whether desperation had pushed him to commit the ultimate crime. In the prosecution's narrative, motive was the key that unlocked everything. Not rage, not passion, but panic. A man cornered by his own lies. But motive alone does not deliver justice. To determine guilt, the case had to move from theory to verdict. In the next chapter, the story enters the courtroom, where every lie, every detail, and every decision would be placed before 12 jurors. Because in the end, it wasn't just Alex Murdaugh on trial. It was the belief that power can outrun truth.
What happens when a man who spent his life inside courtrooms is finally forced to sit on the other side of the law? And what does justice look like when the defendant once controlled the very system now judging him? By the summer of 2022, the slow, methodical investigation had reached a breaking point. The walls had closed in, and the fall of a dynasty was no longer a matter of if, but when. In July 2022, more than a year after the murders at Moselle, the moment arrived. Alex Murdaugh was formally charged with the murders of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. The announcement sent shockwaves through South Carolina and across the nation. A prominent attorney, a member of a powerful legal family, now accused of killing his own family. For many in the Low Country, it felt unreal. For investigators, it was the culmination of months of careful work. Alex Murdaugh pleaded not guilty. He maintained his innocence. But the stage was set for one of the most closely watched trials in modern American true crime history. The trial began in January 2023 in Colleton County, South Carolina. From the very first day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal analysts, members of the public, millions more watched from home. This was not just a murder trial. It was a reckoning with power, privilege, and a system many believed had protected Alex Murdaugh for decades. Over the course of several weeks, jurors heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. Friends described the family dynamic. Law enforcement detailed the investigation. Digital experts explained phone and vehicle data. Financial specialists exposed years of fraud. The prosecution's case centered on one theme: lies. They argued Alex Murdaugh had lied repeatedly before and after the murders. Lies about his finances. Lies about his whereabouts. Lies about his actions on the night Maggie and Paul were killed. Each lie, prosecutors said, wasn't accidental. It was intentional. And together, those lies formed a pattern. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when prosecutors introduced the kennel video recovered from Paul's phone. Jurors listened carefully. Investigators testified that Alex Murdaugh's voice could be heard in the background, placing him at the scene just minutes before the murders. This directly contradicted his earlier statements. Another pivotal moment came when Alex Murdaugh took the stand in his own defense. He admitted to lying repeatedly. He admitted to stealing from clients. But he denied killing his wife and son. For jurors, the question was no longer whether Alex Murdaugh was dishonest. It was whether those lies concealed something far worse. The defense urged jurors to slow down. They argued the case was built on circumstantial evidence. No murder weapons were ever recovered. No eyewitnesses testified to seeing Alex commit the crime. No direct forensic evidence proved he pulled the trigger. They warned jurors not to let emotion replace proof. Alex Murdaugh, they said, was guilty of financial crimes, not murder. But by then, the damage was done. The jury had heard weeks of testimony, and the picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. In closing arguments, prosecutors returned to motive. They reminded jurors that the murders happened at the precise moment Alex Murdaugh's financial crimes were about to be exposed. They argued that Maggie and Paul were not killed out of hatred, but as part of a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The defense made one final plea for reasonable doubt. Then the case was handed to the jury. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The silence was heavy. Alex Murdaugh stood as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. The courtroom absorbed the weight of the moment. A once untouchable legal figure had been convicted of murdering his own family. Justice, many believed, had finally arrived. At sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful rebuke. Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. There would be no release, no second chance, no return to the life he once knew. The Murdaugh legal dynasty, built over generations, was officially over. But the story did not end there. Following the murder conviction, Alex Murdaugh faced justice for his financial crimes. He pleaded guilty to dozens of charges related to fraud, theft, and money laundering. State and federal courts imposed additional prison sentences totaling decades, along with orders for restitution to victims. The man who once represented others in court would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict was swift. The sentence was final. And the message was unmistakable. No name is above the law. No power lasts forever. But even with a conviction, the story was not truly over. Because the Murdaugh case left behind more than prison sentences. It left questions about influence, about accountability, and about how many warning signs were ignored along the way. In the final chapter, we examine the aftermath, the unanswered questions, the lasting impact, and what this case ultimately reveals about justice itself. Because some stories don't end with a verdict, they echo long after the courtroom doors close.
What happens after the verdict is read, after the courtroom empties, and after the headlines begin to fade? Does justice truly end a story like this? Or does it only expose how much was hidden for so long? Even with Alex Murdaugh convicted and sentenced to life in prison, the case did not conclude with certainty. Instead, it left behind silence, damage, and questions that still echo across South Carolina's Lowcountry. In the weeks following the guilty verdict, the reaction was mixed. For some, it was relief, proof that even the most powerful names could be held accountable. For others, it was grief layered upon grief. Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were gone. Mallory Beach was still gone. And countless victims of financial fraud were left to rebuild their lives. The conviction closed a chapter, but it did not erase the harm. The Murdaugh family name, once synonymous with authority and influence, now carried a very different meaning. For nearly a century, the family had shaped the legal landscape of the Lowcountry. Judges, prosecutors, attorneys, the system was familiar and forgiving. But after the trial, that legacy collapsed under scrutiny. Law firms severed ties. Institutions reviewed past cases. Communities began asking questions they had once been afraid to ask. How many times had the system failed to intervene? And how many warning signs had been ignored because of who Alex Murdaugh was? While Maggie and Paul were the most visible victims, they were not the only ones. As financial investigations continued, dozens of victims came forward, many of them individuals who had suffered personal tragedy and trusted Alex Murdaugh to represent them. Settlement money intended for medical care, for families, for futures, gone. Some victims described losing homes. Others described years of financial recovery. For them, the Murdaugh case was not just about murder. It was about betrayal. Even now, questions remain. Were others aware of the financial crimes and chose to look away? Did privilege delay accountability at critical moments? Could earlier intervention have prevented the escalation to violence? No evidence has proven that others directly participated in the murders. But the broader system, one built on familiarity and influence, remains under examination. The case forced South Carolina to confront uncomfortable truths about how power operates when left unchecked. In the aftermath, legal and financial institutions faced pressure to reform. Audits were reviewed. Oversight policies were strengthened. Questions of accountability moved beyond one man. Because Alex Murdaugh did not operate in isolation. His crimes unfolded over years, hidden in plain sight. The system trusted him. And that trust, once broken, revealed how fragile accountability can be when reputation replaces verification. Alex Murdaugh now spends his days in prison, removed from the power, privilege, and protection that once defined his life. The man who controlled courtrooms is now controlled by routine. No influence, no authority, no legacy left to protect. His appeals continue. His guilt is denied, but his freedom is gone. The Murdaugh case will be remembered not just for its brutality, but for what it exposed. It showed how corruption can thrive quietly, how systems can fail slowly, and how justice often arrives only after irreversible loss. It reminded the public that danger does not always look threatening. Sometimes it looks respectable, trustworthy, familiar. This story is not just about murder. It is about what happens when accountability is delayed, when power is inherited instead of earned, and when greed replaces responsibility. Because the most devastating damage is often done long before the crime scene is discovered. The Murdaugh saga is over in the eyes of the court, but its lessons remain. Justice must be watched, power must be questioned, and trust must never replace truth. Because once silence protects wrongdoing, the cost is always human. If you found this case compelling and want to follow more real investigations, courtroom moments, and true crime breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your likes, comments, and turning on the notification bell help you stay updated whenever we release a new story. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Because sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones we trust the most.